When you say treat people like human beings, not political abstractions, that's really, you just outlined in some sense what that means in terms of your practical approach. You're assuming a simplistic stereotype. You're assuming that that's more likely to be applied to people who are different, which I think is true, and that the way through that is meditation on complexity and suffering, and the universality of that, something like that.
On some
Okay.
level, yeah.
Okay. It also means, correct me if I'm wrong, that your unit of analysis is the individual fundamentally.
Yes.
Okay. And that definitely puts you in philosophical opposition to the purveyors of the typical DEI approach, because their fundamental level of analysis, I believe, it seems to be the case. They state that all the time, that it's the group in one form or another.
Yes, but I think they're ultimately confused. I don't think it's deliberate. I think there's some confusion happening.
Yeah, well, these are complex issues,
Yeah.
right? And there are groups of people, and group identity has a reality, and sometimes
Sure.
it's an important reality. And so figuring out how to rank these levels of analysis is no easy business. That's at the essence of the problem in some sense, right? How do you conceptualize the relationship between the individual and the group, given that both those levels of analysis exist?
Yeah, well, I think it's deeper on some level than that, and I have a theory that I want to run by you. I would be very curious to hear your thoughts. So if you look at what a lot of diversity and inclusion consultants say in their slideshows, they say that they are trying to fight against quote unquote whiteness. How do they define whiteness? They define whiteness as, they define it as either or ways of thinking.
Oh yes, I've seen those lists.
And these are, I'm quoting, so you know, either or ways of thinking, power hoarding, analytical forms of thinking, linear forms of thinking, etc.
Yeah, it's really something to see that.
It's incoherent at best. But if you look at what they say they want a kind of interdependency, or an understanding of our interdependence as human beings. They want this sort of relational way of being, right? And what they're essentially arguing for, if I read between the lines correctly, is an end to a kind of alienation that has taken over culturally their lives. And that's interesting, because these diversity consultants tend to be more or less left-wing. But if you were to go into right-wing circles, there's this great book by Timothy Carney called Alienated America, which looks into how many conservative, white, rural-based Americans voted for Trump, or why they voted for Trump in the 2016 primary. So not in the general election, in the primary, when they had other Republicans they could vote for. And he argues that the reason why the people who voted for Trump voted for him was because they were suffering from incredible amounts of alienation. And he traced it back to an experience of, you could actually see which counties that voted for, let's say, Trump over Mitt Romney. These were counties that were more likely suffering from alcoholism and deaths of despair and opioid crises and things of that nature, the disruption of civic institutional life, etc. So I find that this is fascinating, because what this means is you have, on the one hand, left-wing diversity consultants who are confusing, I think they're conflating race with culture in many ways. But what they're calling for is an end to alienation, while simultaneously the way that they're calling for it is alienating towards white, rural, right-wing conservatives who, for a whole host of reasons, but including that, are influenced to vote for individuals like Donald Trump, which means there's a common theme, or which suggests there's a common theme, and the common theme is alienation. So what is it about alienation that creates this kind of behavior in people, regardless of whether they're on the right or the left, to project animosity toward the other, toward the outgroup? What is the role that alienation plays in this entire conversation, and how
what do you think the alienation, what does alienation mean? What's your understanding of that as a phenomenon?
yeah. So I think that the issue is actually civilizational and not political. And so you will find that there are places where I agree with certain left-wing consultants, and there are places where I will agree with certain right-wing critics. But I actually think that what's happening is that fundamentally in America, we've lost a capacity to relate to one another. We've lost a capacity to be in a relational way of being with each other. And actually, I would argue that that goes back all the way to certain aspects of the Enlightenment, and in particular, Descartes. So I would argue, so Descartes is considered by many to be the father of the Enlightenment. But he came up with this idea known as Cartesian duality, which argues that there's a distinction between the mind and the body. Descartes was not even convinced that his own body existed. So his belief was that there was a distinction between the mind and the body, and that not only was there a distinction, but these entities, so to speak, were opposed to each other. And so there's this incredible philosophy of rupture that was perpetuated throughout the Enlightenment, because what that means, if you deny the body fundamentally as relevant or as of significance, what you end up denying is the relevance of human suffering. What you end up denying is the experience of certain aspects of reality that are fundamentally embodied experiences, including things like pain and suffering. Ironically, there's another theme or element within Western history, which exists in the arts that are part of Western history and Western civilization, that do not deny the body. And so I think that this alienation ultimately is centuries in the making and centuries in the coming, and it comes from this philosophy which says,
well, there's also a universal element to that, I would say. And this is something that the Jungians have highlighted, I would say, perhaps more accurately than, although existentialist philosophers and psychologists put their finger on it too, which is this idea of, this is a Heideggerian idea of thrownness. It's sort of the arbitrariness of our existence. So, you know, you happen to be a black woman and I happen to be a white man, and we didn't choose that. It's just pop, here we are, and there are preconditions to our existence that we didn't choose. We're also beneficiaries of and puppets of the culture that we happen to inhabit. And the culture was made by people who weren't us and who are no longer alive. And so it's not our own creation, and none of us feel entirely comfortable within it. That's an inescapable part of the human condition. It's
sure.
We're subjugated to suffering mortality. That's the biological hell in some sense, but we're also subject to the arbitrariness of our cultural constructions. And that's a permanent existential problem. And then there would be, idiosyncratic variants of it that would be culture specific, that are more what would you say? You can use the example of Descartes in the West in that more specific sense. So it's a universal problem, this idea of alienation. And part of the question is, how do you overcome that? And when you were talking about sympathy with universal suffering and appreciation for complexity and diversity, I had images of crucifixion in my imagination. Thought, well, part of the reason that image was a very strange image to be worshipped, to be so, to be regarded as sacred for so long, to be so central. It is a image of the universality of suffering and inexhaustibility. And so, and it's to see that crucified possibility in every individual. That's at the center of Christian ethos, and
but also the capacity to transcend it.
Right. Well, that's built into that story, and it requires a death and a rebirth, right? And you can think of that psychologically as well as ontologically. That's the religious question: is what does that mean in terms of the structure of reality? But we do redeem our crucified diversity and all the trouble that gets us into by a sequence of deaths and rebirths. That happens every time we're wrong, and we have to rebuild ourselves. And in any narrative of redemption, like the Exodus story, you see that as well. This escape from tyranny, this descent into chaos, and then reconfiguration. And so I thought in Maps of Meaning, I posited that identification with that process was redemptive rather than any of the states, right? It's that you are this thing that's on this journey of continual self-transcendence. And
it's the process itself. But the issue is that Cartesian duality, or one of the issues is that Cartesian duality in its obsession with certainty and mathematical certainty has a problem with the unknown, an existential problem with the unknown, because it's fixated with certainty. And I know that in Maps of Meaning, you draw this connection to, I believe it was Milton's depiction of the adversary, of Satan, and how the evil being is not someone who represents the other, but someone who cannot handle the unknown and who is fixated on certainty of an absolute sense. And in being fixated with certainty, claims to be God, right? And I can see that trend within the Cartesian revolution, or the Cartesian element of the Enlightenment. In being obsessed with certainty, you deny your shadow.